is the right way or the wrong way. Or it could be named the path not taken. Now Shakespeare's Hamlet is a very famous play, and he came up with a lot of sayings that have become part of our language, and one of them is, something is rotten in the state of Denmark. Well, it came to mean that something fishy was going on. People are saying one thing and doing something else. In this passage, or just before this passage, something was rotten in the state of Denmark. We have this idea that David was a man after God's own heart. And you say, well, where did we get that idea? Well, God said it, and so it makes sense that we would take that into account. But in the chapter of 27 to 29, it doesn't seem like David is a man after God's own heart. And which is strange, because God had sent Samuel to David and anointed him king, and so he knew he was going to be king, because everything Samuel said came true, but he didn't give him the timeline. What date? Can I mark it on my calendar when I'm going to become king? Well, no, you can't. Just trust me on this. Well, you know the story, and I'm going to go over it quickly, and you will remember all these things. It starts off, David is the shepherd, and then he goes and kills Goliath, and Saul says, I'm going to keep you here. And Saul loves David. And Jonathan loves David even more. If you remember the story, Jonathan gave him his armor. And then David went out with the battle. And David won, and he was so successful, and the people loved him so much that they came up with a song. Saul has killed his thousands, and David has killed his tens of thousands. And that was all true, but that didn't make Saul, King Saul, happy at all, because he said, what more can he have except the kingdom? So that love he had for him turned to hate. And in God's word, it says the people loved David. Well, here's what happened is, Jonathan met David. He explained what happened, and he'd have to run, and he ran to hide, he ran to escape the death penalty. And there's an illustration in that story that shows you that sin has consequences. Now, people who don't like the Bible and want to make like this, they say, the Bible says that a man is to have only one wife. But all these patriarchs in the Bible, like Abraham and David, had more than one wife. So what's right? What's going on? Is the Bible just full of mistakes? And can we trust it at all? And the problem is, and this is what someone else, Ravi Zacharias, said, the problem is they don't know how to read the Bible. And he said, Ravi said, if you read the Bible and you read the accounts of these men of God, every one of them that had multiple wives had terrible strife came with it. And it's true. Just because the Bible reports on something doesn't mean it's advocating it. It doesn't mean it's saying this is a good thing. Just because men of God go off the path doesn't mean, well, it means that we're all sinners. Well, here's that story I was going to tell you of. David is running away to hide, and he comes to the tabernacle. And he comes to the priest in the tabernacle, and he says, the priest is scared because why is he here? What's wrong? Well, I'm on a secret mission for King Saul, and I have to leave so fast I brought no food, so I have no food and I have no sword. Can you help me? Well, he says, I have the sword of Goliath, and I have showbread that has been removed. And so he gave them both. And so it was all a lie. And King Saul found out about it. King Saul discovered the lie, and they brought the priest there, and the priest is totally innocent in this manner, but Saul won't believe him. So Saul kills the priest, or he has someone do it. Then they kill 84 of his fellow priests that are related to him, and then they kill all their wives, and then all their children, and all the livestock in the city that they live. Well, one lie doesn't cause any harm, will it? Well, yes, it will. One lie did cause a lot of harm. And one priest escaped and came to David, and he said, well, in retrospect, I remember that there was a guy there, and I knew that this story would get back, so it's really my fault. But I made you into a criminal, and you might as well stay with me because I'm a criminal too. That's not very comforting, is it? Yeah, I'm responsible for the death of your wife and family and everyone in your... But you might as well stay with me. Well, now David hid in the wilderness, and it says he gathered around him basically ne'er-do-wells, a group of losers. These are the people that couldn't make it in life, and they came to him. And so he gathered these men around him, and he trained them, and he's in the wilderness, and Saul keeps chasing after him, and twice in this time, Saul is in a position that David is able to kill him, and both times he says, I will not kill the appointed of the Lord. And God protects him through all this, and he still has the promise of being king. And then everything went south. And then when I say that, it could be southwest or northwest. I'm not sure which direction he went from Judah to the Philistines, but he left. And the question you have to ask is, did David think God's arm was too short to protect him? Or did he think that God had forgotten about the promise to make him king? Or maybe it was that trusting God was just too hard. Maybe he thought he would go there and wait it out, and when Saul was dead, he would come back. Well, the problem is that when you're out of the will of God, things just happen to push you farther and farther away, and makes it harder and harder to come back. By all rights, the path that David was on should have kept him from becoming anything but an important servant of an unimportant man. Now, if he continued on this path, he should have spent his life as an enemy of God and an enemy of the people, or I should say, away from God and an enemy of God's people. And this should have happened if God hadn't intervened and helped him in spite of himself. Sometimes, or I should say many times, do you remember Laurel and Hardy? Well, Hardy had this famous saying, "This is a fine mess you've gotten us into, Ollie." Well, it was a fine mess David had gotten himself into. And not only did he get himself into it, he got all the 600 men that were with him, and their wives and their children. He got them all in this mess because, you see, he had brought them to God. He had been very careful that they would serve God because that was what he did, but now he had taken them away from the presence of God, and he was putting God on the back burner. There's a note, I call it a warning, in 1 Samuel 27, verse 1 and 2. No, verse 7, sorry. 27:7. The number of days that David lived in the country of the Philistines was 1 year and 4 months. Now, look, sometimes we get impatient with God. If you remember the story of Saul, Saul was told to wait till Samuel came and had the sacrifice and gave him instructions. And Saul waited for Samuel, and he waited a week, and it was the time he was supposed to come, and Saul said, well, I'm going to do the sacrifice myself. And then an hour later, Samuel showed up. Said, what have you done? You had no business doing that. You see, sometimes we know God has said that He's going to provide, and if we waited another day or another week or another month, or in the case of David, another 16 months, he would have been in the exact position he needed to be for them to anoint him king. Well, you see, sometimes we get tired, and in the aftermath of the disaster we created, we found out that if we held off for that short period of time, God was coming. We just had to wait a little bit longer. You see, if David had stayed the course for another year and 4 months, he would have been in the place where he needed to be, where they could crown him king. In verse 28, verse 1 and 2, it says, this is what happened. This is what happened when he didn't wait. And it came about in the days that the Philistines gathered their armed camps for war to fight against Israel, that Achish said to David, know assuredly that you will go out with me in the camp, you and your men. And David said to Achish, very well, you shall know what your servant can do. So Achish said to David, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. See, this tells you that David, who was to be king of Israel, had committed to becoming the enemy of Israel. He was going to fight a war against them. And in Samuel 18:16, this is the guy. It says, and all of Israel and Judah loved David, and he went out and came in before them. And that's not the only verse that tells how much the people of Israel, he was their chosen son. He was the one that everyone was looking to. It was why Saul was afraid of him, because everyone loved him. And now he'd come to the point he was going to go to war against them, and because he was a great leader, not only was he going to destroy his future, he was going to make the same bad choice for all those men and their families too. And it's too late now. David is an honorable man, and he says, look, I'm going to do this, and he would have. And there's no one and nothing that can save him. Now, it's too late. He's made his choice. And so, if he goes to war and wins, he still loses. Win or lose, he still made himself someone who will never be able to go back to his native land of Israel. Achish said this. He was wise enough to understand what was going on, and he said, he will make his people abhor him, and he will be my servant forever. See, Achish knew that when he did something like that, there was no going back. I did say nothing and no one could save him, but that's not true. God could save him. And it says that if you read the story, that the kings of the Philistines said, wait a minute, this David, isn't he the man who they said Saul has killed his thousands, is David his tens of thousands? We don't want this man. They said, this is a bad idea to put David in the middle of the battle. He may change the battle in favor of Israel. And you think about it, there was 600 of them, and there was probably 100,000 of each of the two groups fighting, and they thought he was going to change the course of the war. But anyway, the point was that God did this. so he was sent away. In spite of all, you see, this is God's doing. In spite of what David was doing, God was saying, you're not going to spoil the plan that I've set in place. Now, we have this thing called the Star of David. It's the theme, or the Israel has it on their flag. Can you imagine? The Star of David is this bodyguard to a king whose no one has ever heard tell of. No, he would never be. There would never be a Star of David. Now, this is all, I haven't got to the sermon yet. This is kind of working up toward it. So it's time we started because the clock is moving along. So number one is women and children first. And first, in chapter 30, it said, Then it happened when David and his men came to Ziklag on the third day that the Amalekites had made a raid on the Negeb and on Ziklag, and had overthrown Ziklag and burned it with fire. And they took captives the women and all that were in it, both small and great, without killing anyone, and carried them off and went their way. When David and his men came to the city, behold, it was burned with fire, and their women and their sons and their daughters had been taken captive. Then David and his people who were with him lifted their voices and wept until there was no strength in them to weep. Now David's two wives had been taken captive, Ahinoam and the Jezreelite, and Abigail, the widow of Nabal, the Carmelite. Moreover, David was greatly distressed because the people spoke of stoning him, for all the people were embittered, every one because of his sons and his daughters. Now, when men make a bad decision, they're not the only one that suffer because of it. Their family, their wives, their children suffer. There's a group called, oh dear, it's on the tip of my tongue, Angel Tree. Angel Tree, Chuck Colson started this for men who are in prison, because he knows that men who are in prison, one thing, they can't buy Christmas presents for their children, they can't provide for birthday presents, their children get picked on at school because your dad's a criminal, your dad's in jail, jailbird. All those things happen when a man makes a bad decision. Now, if you remember, David, later, when he was king, saw Bathsheba, and he made a bad decision. Not only did that decision hurt him, it hurt his family, because the son that Bathsheba had died, and David was told that strife would always be in his house. He lost 3 of his other sons because of that too. In this case, the mistake was that the cost to the women and children is they were all taken into captivity, and everything they owned was either stolen or burned. And there wasn't a lot of this, let's just look on the bright side, man, when they got back to the town. You see, they were standing in a town that the houses were just smoldering ruins, and they spent the last year trying to fix these up to make them their own. It says they cried until there was no tears left to cry. And they even spoke of stoning him. Now, we're separated this by half a world away in 3,000 years, so we can talk about a silver lining in all of this, but they couldn't see it. The mercy in this is there was nothing left for them to hold on to. Everything they owned and everything they loved had been taken away. So what's the reason for them to stay with the Philistines? They have only one option. God's left them one option: leave. Get out of Dodge. Well, number two is accept defeat or get it back. 6b says, But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Then David said to Abiathar, the priest, the son of Ahimelech, please bring me the ephod. So Abiathar brought the ephod to David. And David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue this band? Shall I overtake them? And he said, pursue, and you shall surely overtake them, and you will rescue all. Then David went, he and the 600 men that were with him, and came to the brook Besor, where those left behind remained. And David pursued, he and the 400 men, and the 200 who were too exhausted to cross the brook remained behind. Now, I like this verse. David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. It's one of those great verses of the Bible. It's David, and he's back. It's the David we love. It's the David after God's own heart. And it wasn't because some of the children of the community of Ziklag were singing Jesus Loves Me, and or whatever the song would be at that time, that would be a nice worship song. And he said, oh yes, that's right, I've left God. No, it required him to lose everything and everyone he loved. Sometimes the cost of God shaking you is the cost that others have to pay also. It's expensive for them too. Now, if you happen to be a non-Christian and God comes and wants you and he shapes you, well, the good thing is that you change and you become a Christian, and that's all good. And it's the same as it's good for someone who's a Christian has moved away from God, and God comes and he shakes everything up, and you go back to God just like David did. But there's a cost to the people around you. It was an expensive cost too. Remember, it said the men were crying, but I suspect the women were doing a lot of crying too, because they knew well enough that as they sheltered their children and held their children in this march that took for days and days, that when they got there, that may be the last time they ever saw their children. They may be sold to some other person as a slave, and they may never see them again. And all of these costs, they can see. Now, they knew that there was no possibility of help coming for them, because they knew that their men were off to war in maybe a month before they're back. And in the course of that month, their lives would be changed forever. They'd been sold and gone. Nothing anyone could do. The best possible outcome is the man who bought any particular woman would also buy her children, but that was a faint hope. And also the hope would be that if once he had decided to take her, that he would treat her fairly and kindly. But you know, that's usually not what happens. I love that verse. David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And that was great for him, but do you think any of the women and children were feeling that too? Now, I want to go back to David and how he went to the priest and said please and inquired of the Lord, but we can't overlook the fact that there was real pain and suffering involved, because David was outside God's will, and all of this was required to bring him back. We have this picture of David, the shepherd boy, holding a lamb in his arms. You can picture the picture you saw in Sunday school. He's holding a lamb. He's killed a lion to rescue the lamb, and that's the picture we have of David. But that's not the picture. In chapter 27, verse 9, it says, David attacked the land and did not leave a man or a woman alive, and he took away the sheep and the cattle and the donkeys and the camels and the clothing. And he returned and came to Achish. What David was doing was he had turned into a band of mercenaries. They were living in Ziklag. They would go and they would destroy cities and take all they owned. That really doesn't make it look like the picture we see of David. Well, In verse 7, David says, please. And I think to myself as I read that, he says, please bring me the ephod. He stopped being the commander and said, please, to the priest. He said, help me find out what God, the true commander, wants me to do. I'll ask humbly, and I won't demand. And maybe I'll get back to being the man after God's own heart that I was before. And God gave him good news. Pursue, and you will find, and you will capture, and you will get everything back. Without any chastisement. You remember some of the other times that David went away from God, there was all sorts of things that happened bad. Not this time. Now, before you start to say, okay, I can relax. Peter's told me all this bad news and I can sit back in my seat and relax. I want to remind you of something. They had marched 3 days from Ziklag to the Philistine army with carrying all their weapons and all their armor and all of their supplies on their back. And they had spent a day there maybe, and they were sent back. And so they marched 3 days back. And now, because of this good news of God saying you're going to pursue, and they're off in hot pursuit. And that was with no rest, and they knew that when they finally caught up, there would be a battle. And it was so, these men were so tired that 200 had to stop and they could go no farther. So that meant only 400 left for this battle. Now, number 3 is, this is David's spoil. 16 to 20 says, then David said, will you bring me down to the band? And he said, swear to me by God that you will not kill me or deliver me into the hands of my master. When he brought him down, behold, they were spread out all over the land, eating and drinking and dancing because of the great spoil that they had taken from the land of Philistines, from the land of Judah. And David slaughtered them from twilight until evening of the next day, and not a man of them escaped except 400 young men who rode on camels and fled. And David recovered all that he had taken, including his 2 wives. Now, you know, it says they arrived, and there was a great battle, and they killed everyone except 400 men who rode off on camels. You know that there was only 400 men in their army, and they killed so many that it said just 400 left. Just 400 escaped. You know, if there was 500 men in the group and 400 escaped, it wouldn't say just. There was a big battle, there was a lot of men. 24 hours. Now, this miracle was provided by God. He gave them the strength after these 7 to 9 days, 9 days of marching probably, and a day of battle. And he took the strength away from the men who they fought against. Now, something else is they got the joy. These men got the joy of being the rescuers, the heroes that saved their wives and their children. What a wonderful thing. Their wives had said they came. There was no chance. There was no chance. How did this happen? We've been saved. Now, they would never be forgotten. Their children would tell their grandchildren about how they had been saved by their great-great-grandfathers come and saved them. And their wives would always be grateful when they thought of this, because they would recognize what if they hadn't come, or if they'd lost the battle. Now, people if you don't think that people would remember this, I was watching a commercial about the Dutch. Now the Dutch remember that Canada saved them in the Second World War. They liberated the Dutch, and they also dropped plane loads of food so that because they were starving, and they fed them and they liberated them. And there was in the video it shows this young woman said, my parents said, you have to bring one of these soldiers home so we can show them how much we appreciate him. And she married him. So you wonder how many Dutch women married Canadian soldiers just because they had to. It's the least I could do for this hero who saved me. Now, they called it all David's spoil because not only did they get everything back that they had lost, but they got all the stuff that they collected from all the other places. Now, the last point is called wicked and worthless men. 21 to 23. When David came to the 200 men who were too exhausted to follow David, who had been left at the brook Besor, they went out to meet David and to meet the people who were with him. And David approached the people and greeted them. Then all the wicked and worthless men among them who went with David said, because they did not go with us, we will not give them any of the spoil that we have recovered, except every man gets his wife and his children, and that they may leave them away and depart. Then David said, you must not do this, my brethren, with what God has given us, who has kept us and delivered into our hand the band that came against us. Now, remember I talked about these heroes, these wonderful heroes, but there's a mixed bag of these heroes. How can these heroes, these wonderful men who would save the wives and the children, be called wicked and worthless? It's incredible, right? These men had followed David into the jaws of hell and spent every bit of their strength fighting for a righteous cause to save house and family against impossible odds. And now this, the writer called them wicked and worthless. You see, some men want to be led well. They want to have the honor and glory of doing some great thing, to fight the good fight. But some of them were never good men. You see, if they had good men who they followed, who were really good men and not just good leaders, they were maybe able to not do all these things that were the worst tendencies and their traits were we kept at bay. And if they were able to do this without becoming horrible, then they would be seen as good men. And as far as anyone else knew, these were good men too. And that was what David was doing. He was saying, you cannot. Just because you've been blessed by God, don't hurt the people that are less fortunate. And who are the people less fortunate? That's the 200 men who didn't come. Now, when you say these people were too weak, bear in mind that they weren't weak men at all. They marched for 7 or 8 days carrying everything, and it was just that they were with some exceptionally strong men. The other 400 were stronger. But you can imagine when families got together and they were reminiscing and they were saying, do you remember when Dad came and rescued us? Do you remember when my husband, and there would be 200 families that would go like this and say, no, my dad stayed at the brook. He was too tired. Dad couldn't come and rescue me. He was too tired. Can you imagine bearing that shame for the rest of your life? I thought, it's just sad. But God rescued them, and the problem was that it was God. They couldn't take credit for it. Do you remember the battle where Joshua was fighting the Amalekites, and Moses held up his hands, and his hands got tired, and his arms got tired, and when he put his arms down, they lost, and when he pulled his arms up, they won, and Aaron held up his arms. Well, they couldn't take credit for winning. They were in the battle. They fought, but it was God's victory. And now the battle was won and the victory had been achieved. And David was trying his best to say, you know, I led you away from God, but now I'm trying to lead you back, and we're going to do this the right way now. So what lessons can we learn in this time of craziness? On the one hand, a month ago, we remembered the policemen that had died 6 years ago, the 3 policemen that had died. And we praised those 3 policemen. I knew one of them, a man called David Ross. And he was a wonderful Christian man who came to Hillside. And I remember this to this day. I can see the picture of him in my mind. I can see the clothes racks behind his head as he came to me and said, Peter, how are you doing? And he was so sincere that I could tell he loved me. Now, he didn't come to me because I was special, because I wasn't. He came to me because he was special. He was exceptional, and I bet you if I followed him, he did the same thing and he made other people there feel special. He was a wonderful man. Now, you see, many police officers are both good men and women, and they're kind and they want to do a good job. And if they had good leaders like David, who demanded they be good and do heroic and good deeds, then they would. You see, if you have a good leader and they would do good. Now, we as Christians are called to be like the David in the end of this story and give honor and glory to God in all situations. We have to be willing to see that our thoughts and actions, when they no longer honor God, we have to be willing to say, no, we will strengthen ourselves in the Lord our God. That's what David did. He stepped down from the throne of his life and he let God sit on the throne, back where he was supposed to be, back where he belonged. It's the only way that works. David Jeremiah, pastor on the radio, told this story of when he was in his church early in his ministry, and he and most of the church had decided they were going to do these wonderful things, but there was one man who was very vocal against everything he did, and he was leading some of the church away. And so they had a meeting, and the meeting was to decide if they were going to do what he wanted to do as pastor, or if they decided against it, that would be his final meeting. He would leave as a pastor. And so the man was at the pulpit, and he was saying all manner of things, not very nice things about David Jeremiah, who was standing over here, waiting to get his turn to say. And the guy was very, very enthusiastic, and he was trying to, but he was not winning. He knew the crowd was not following him. And so, in the end, he was so mad, he just went like this, and he backhanded David Jeremiah right across the face. Right in public, right in front of the entire church. And so what happened was, in the eyes of the church, he moved away from being a faithful follower of God to a wicked man. And he soon left the church in disgrace. Now, the difference between David and some of these 400 warriors is when he found God, that God hadn't left him. He found that God was still there wanting him. He rushed back to him. But these other men, who are called wicked and worthless, were happy not to be involved with God at all. Now, we want to recognize that some can do heroic things, but still be wicked and worthless. All these men shared the same experience. God gave them this impossible victory. And David fully acknowledged it. And he was deeply grateful. But the others became resentful and said, this is my stuff, and I'm not sharing it with those other men. Wait, David said, this is what God gave us. Don't make possessions your God. Worship the God that saved us. Worship the God that gave us everything. He's the giver of all good things, and I want to share him as much as I can. You see, sometimes it isn't the task that God sets before us that God will judge us on. It wasn't the victory, it was the state of their heart. And we found that those men's state of heart was not good. You see, it says that from the heart all manner of wickedness will come. And when that happens, we need to strengthen ourselves in the Lord so we won't be found wanting in the end. So, we have a choice when things go badly. We can blame God and leave, but God is faithful. And even if we do, as Christians, blame him and we leave, he's still waiting to bring us back. Like he did for Peter the Apostle. He said, when you come back, strengthen your brethren. But better still, we know that God can bring us back like he did for David, but better still, remain faithful. So no rescue is needed. So that you can be at the right place at the right time. When God is going to bless us, God doesn't need to do the extra work of rescuing us so that we're back in the right place. So let's do our best to remain faithful, even when things are all going badly. Let's pray.